So hello everyone. Welcome to IMIM seminar. I'm Dong Chen from Indiana University. Today we welcome Tony uh, from Arizona State University talking about this great paper, which is I think forthcoming in Brookings, uh, which is Trade War and the Dollar Anchor. And Antonio will discuss this paper. Tony, you have 45 minutes.
Okay. Cool. Thanks. Thank you so much for the organizers, for giving me this chance to talk about this paper. Yeah. So, as Dongchen mentioned, this was a Brookings paper, and so the style of the paper is a little bit different from, I guess, a typical economic research paper. And also the fact that, it comes out in Brookings, means that we didn't have that much time to present it and show it around, even though once we wrote it, we realized there was some pretty nice economic stories coming out of it. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk. This is joint work with frequent co-authors Tarek and Thomas, and Jingye, who's in Renmin University. Um, the usual disclaimers apply because Thomas is at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Okay. Um, so, what's happening with this paper? Essentially, following Liberation Day tariff announcements, we saw this growing concern about the dollar's role in the international sphere. Antonio has written a lot about this, and I'm looking forward to this discussion later. But basically, we saw that the dollar began losing some of its correlation with global measures of economic stress. We saw depreciation against foreign currencies, which, typically, if you know anything about the dollar, it's a safe haven currency that rises during bad times and economic uncertainty. We saw international investors retrench from US stocks. They sold off. And then there was an increase in long-term yields, which again is counter to the typical intuition of, a flight to safety phenomenon. And so the natural question to ask is whether the trade war that President Trump started is eroding some of the financial privileges that the US has been enjoying for the last 20, 30 years. And so in this paper, we present a risk-based model of the dollar as a safe haven currency. And also, we show how it's connected to its status as an anchor currency for the international financial system. We then evaluate the effects of the trade war on this international financial system, and we show how it does change and erode U.S. financial privileges and to what extent. So that's where we're going to go in this paper. To start off with, I'm going to review 4 facts about the international financial system and the role of the dollar. And the first fact is one that everyone is probably already familiar with. You've seen this many different times, but it's just the fact that the US is a safe haven currency. The way we're showing it here is on the y-axis, we're plotting the change in the broad dollar index. So that's the average of the dollar against 26 foreign currencies, relative to changes in a measure of global risk. And in generally, what you see is that as risk goes up, the value of the dollar goes up as well. And when risk declines, the value of the dollar tends to decline as well. The red dots here are like the global pandemic, and then global financial crisis, and you can see a particularly strong correlation between the value of the dollar and measures of global risk during these periods. It's kind of interesting is that these green dots, these 4 green X's, that's what's been happening after the Liberation Day announcements, and you can see that it's kind of flat. And so it's not, I mean, obviously this is not like some econometric test, but there is basically the point is that following, April 2nd announcements of tariffs, this relationship between economic stress and dollar appreciation seems to have flattened a little, or it's not there in the data. Now, it is this relationship between economic stress and currency appreciation is true for some other currencies as well, like the euro and Japanese yen. But for the most part, currencies tend to depreciate when economic stress goes up. What we're showing on this slide is fact number 2, which is that the currencies that are safe, like the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, they tend to pay lower returns for investing in their currencies. And so this is a well-known fact already as well, first shown by people like Hanno Lustig and Adrian Verdelon. But the idea is that basically currency safety explains cross-country differences in returns and investment and also interest rates. A pretty natural extension of this is that, once you have differences in risk-free rates across countries, that can be explained by currency risk premium. These differences in interest rates pass on into firms' cost of capital. And so more recent papers, say by Julian Reichers, shows that these differences in risk-free government borrowing rates pass into firm borrowing rates. And then so firms in countries like the US or Europe, they can accumulate more capital and have lower marginal production of capital. But yeah, lower cost of capital. Sorry. What am I saying? Okay, the fourth fact has to do with the structure of the international financial system. There are, there are kind of four related facts that we're talking about here, but the big ones are that the vast majority of countries in the world, if you go by the Reinhard-Rogoff data, about two-thirds of them stabilize their currencies relative to the US dollar. So, almost everyone, almost everyone, not almost everyone, just an overwhelming majority of countries, they're choosing to stabilize. They're not choosing to freely float. In fact, the only countries that do let their currency float are large economies like the European Monetary Union, the US, or Japan. Moreover, there's a strict hierarchy of how countries stabilize. Smaller countries tend to stabilize more strictly. Okay, they're more likely to impose hard pegs, as shown by the first column here on the right-hand figure. Whereas as you get larger and larger, you're less likely to impose hard pegs. You might do soft pegs, or you might start to float. And then, of course, yeah, as I mentioned already, larger countries float. What you notice from this is that when countries stabilize their currencies, in an earlier paper I had with Tarek and Thomas, we showed that those countries that do stabilize, they tend to be able to lower their interest rates and pay lower returns on the currencies, primarily because they're inheriting some of the safety properties of the US dollar because they're stabilizing to it. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the paper. But, we started off by observing these four facts. We're going to write down a model that is going to target these four facts that can explain all of them through a risk-based perspective. And then we're going to show what happens now when we introduce the trade war. So this is just another way of showing how small currencies stabilize, larger currencies don't. We can move on. I don't know, by the way, I don't know how, I'll take a moment here before we begin all the hard math to just say, I don't know how this goes, but if you guys have questions, you can feel free to interrupt me at any time. Okay. What I'm going to lay out on these next two slides is our way of thinking about the world. It's a very standard model of exchange rate determination. There's not that many bells and whistles. There's going to be one source of heterogeneity across countries, and that's going to be differences in country size. Okay, it's a fairly simple model to work with. So we have two periods. There's a unit mass of households. They're split into n countries, and theta n is going to be the measure of their size. The U.S. is going to be the largest economy in this world, followed by the Euro area, Japan, and so on. Households, in the first period, they're going to invest, and second period, they're going to consume. They'll consume and they gain utilities. Okay, so the utility of the household is the value is coming from their expected consumption, or their expected utility is coming from their expected consumption. There's going to be, hopefully you can see the highlighting. There's going to be a demand shock highlighted here. That's the chi, and then they're consuming this Cobb-Douglas aggregate of a traded good and a non-traded good. Alpha is a share of the traded goods. Households have some risk aversion that's being represented by gamma here. Okay. Households own firms that produce the local non-traded good. Okay, so there's a productivity shock on the non-traded good, and then there's some capital that's used in the production of non-traded good. What each household is in the first period, they're going to be endowed with 1 unit of capital, and that unit of capital can be shipped around freely. Okay, so they can make an investment decision to say where is the capital going to go. And in the second period, they're also endowed with a unit of the traded good, which is a numeraire that can also be shipped around, and they can use it to consume. Okay. If you look at the setup on the previous slide, this what you're going to notice is there's basically two shocks here. There's a chi. I'm back on this slide. Sorry. There's a chi here that's serving as a demand shock, and there's an eta here on the production of non-traded good that's like a supply shock. Okay. So there's two shocks: a chi demand shock and a supply shock. Okay. And that's it. Those two shocks are going to describe the state space. Households and firms are price takers, and markets are going to clear. Okay. And so we have these two shocks here. What does the asset space look like? We're going to allow households to trade stocks and country-specific risk-free bonds. Okay, so we're going to be two types of assets, two types of shocks. And so to the first order, the financial markets are going to be complete. And so in order to solve this, we're just setting up the social planners problem, taking first order conditions, log linearizing. We're doing, the very basic stuff. And so then we can solve for allocations of the traded and non-traded goods in the second period. There's a little bit more complications in the paper that I'm not going to talk about here, but in order to do some numerical exercises, we split households into a financier sector and a household and a consumer sector, and that helps that allows us to target things like size of risk premiums and the like. Okay, that's a description of the model. How does it work? Very common in this type of model, what you're going to see is that countries are going to appreciate whenever demand exceeds supply. Okay. You can write down each country's ends average log real exchange rate. So the broad dollar exchange rate, for example, we're going to denote this by S bar. That's going to be determined by that country's supply shock and demand shock. If demand is high, their currency appreciates. If supply is low, that currency appreciates. Okay. So, when I have a lot of excess demand in the US, having dollars is really valuable because it allows me to buy the US consumption bundle, and that is worth a lot. When that currency appreciates, when a country's currency appreciates, that country will consume more traded goods. There's higher traded good demand per capita. All right, so when my dollar's worth a lot, I'm going to import a lot of goods and I'm going to consume more. And so now you got to think, what does that do for the rest of the world? Well, when the US consumes goods, it's obviously taking goods away from the rest of the world. And this is true for all countries, but it's particularly important for countries like the US because the US is large. Shocks to larger countries, they're going to have an outsized impact on the rest of the world because, if households in the US consume more and there's a lot of US households and we're really rich, we're going to consume a lot more of the world's traded goods. And so the impact of a large country on the world price of traded goods is going to be determined by how large that country is. Okay. And so there's a couple.
So Tony, I have a question. So here, if we have a tariff, let's say tau, does it affect demand or supply?
It's going to affect demand. Supply is, so the way that we think about this tariff, and we're going to show you in a few slides down the road, is that it's going to distort the price of the traded good for the US households. And so that's going to impact how much the US households consume. Okay. So it's not going to affect the production.
Does it depend on size? Because I can foresee that if it worked through the demand channel, it would appreciate the domestic currency, which is the US dollar. So small tariff rate is actually good for the country. Is that true?
That's a great question. We're gonna talk about that later on when
Yeah,
so I'm absolutely gonna pause that for the moment because I think so in short you're right. But it's a little more complicated than that, and so we'll talk about that once we introduce the
sure.
tariff.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. I just wanted to get for now, let's talk just the basic mechanism of why is dollar safe in this world. When the dollar appreciates, at the same time that the dollar is appreciating, um, the US is taking traded goods from the rest of the world, and so the world price of traded goods is also appreciating. And so what happens then is that dollars are high whenever the price of traded goods in the world is high. And we can use the price of traded goods here because it's a homogeneous traded good. We can use it as the numeraire, okay, as an indicator of economic stress. So whenever the world is stressed, that value of traded goods is high, the dollar has appreciated. Other currencies, because they're coming from smaller countries, they have less impact on the rest of the world. And so naturally, their correlation with the world price of traded goods is not as tight, it's not as high. Once you get that intuition in place, the fact that the dollar appreciates whenever world price of traded goods is high, you immediately are going to get the first three facts that we have about the international financial system. The dollar is the safest currency. Why? Well, because its currency is going to covary more with the global price of traded goods than any other country's currency. So holding on to that currency is really valuable. Whenever you're feeling like crap, well, if I'm holding on to the dollar, it's paying off the most on average, right? Large economies, they're going to have lower interest rates. You can apply a very pretty basic amount of asset pricing to show that the difference in investing in two different currencies is really just going to, in this world, it's just going to come down to the difference in how much each of the currencies co-varies with the world price of traded goods. So this is from a very old paper now. And then with a little bit more math, once you have the firms there, you can show that equation two, the difference in return investing in currencies, is then going to naturally spill over into difference in investing in firms. And so the US firms are going to have the lowest cost of capital, and they're more valuable because US firms or payoffs, cash flows from US firms, they're in dollars, and they also tend to be the most correlated with the global price of traded goods. Another way of saying global price of traded goods is just a stochastic discount factor. Depending on either language is fine. And so there you go. So you have the first three facts. US shocks have large impacts on the rest of the world. And that's the key behind dollar safety. And once you have dollar safety, that gives you all of the financial benefits that we know the US has benefited from for the last 30 years. Now we're going to talk about a trade war. Okay, suppose the U.S. imposes a tariff on imports, and we're going to also assume at the same time that other countries retaliate because that's kind of what happens. The way we do it is we literally just drive a wedge between the world price of traded goods and what the U.S. households see. So we're just going to tax. We're adding a tax that's proportional to how much they consume. Okay. The way we do it in our framework is that this is going to affect demand. All right. When you have a high Tau, in those states of the world where the US, dollar has appreciated and I would really like to consume more goods. Well, I'm taxing those states of the world. I'm taxing traded consumption in those states of the world, so I'm going to consume less. And so what we're doing, what effectively the trade war does here is it breaks down the covariance between US consumption. Sorry, it breaks down the covariance between the broad dollar exchange rate and the world price of traded goods. Why? When the dollar is high, it used to be the case that I would import a lot of goods, and that would be bad times for the rest of the world. Now, whenever the dollar is high, I would have consumed a lot of traded goods, but I don't anymore because consumption of traded goods is taxed. So I consume fewer traded goods in the world, and then the world price of traded goods doesn't rise as much. Okay. The US is no longer such a large systemic shock to the rest of the world because I'm breaking that link between that risk sharing between the US and the rest of the world. I'm saying this all in like a couple of different ways, but all of this is the same. What happens when you have a trade war is that it dampens the US shock's effects on the rest of the world. Mathematically, you can show that effectively it's like reducing the size of the US. It reduces the impact of the US in the determination of the global price of traded goods. And therefore, it breaks down the covariance between the US and the stochastic discount factor. It's going to erode dollar safety. Dongchen did mention that yes, there's a secondary there's effect. So I'm talking about the covariance here, but there's also another effect where having the shock does also because I'm consuming less, it's also going to appreciate the dollar a little bit. But it turns out the covariance, in order to answer your question, the covariance part dominates, and so that's why in the end, the tariff is quite bad for the price of the pricing of assets. So all these nice effects, basically, okay, so what happens now, because we've broken down this covariance, the nice effects of the nice financial benefits the US tends to benefit from, they declines. Okay. In the paper, we do a numerical exercise where we calibrate our model to pretty standard moments. And what we start off is we try to set our model up so that we can match some pretty basic targets from the pre-pandemic period and the pre-tariff period. Specifically, we're targeting the difference in interest rates across countries. So the US minus big country minus small countries. So US minus Australia, New Zealand. We target the differences in currency excess returns. We target the correlation between exchange rate and consumption growth. We target the standard deviation consumption growth. The point is that we're targeting some moments to set up our model so that we match the state of the world prior to the tariff announcements. And then what we do is we impose a tariff and see what happens to asset prices, interest rates, stock prices, and exchange rate volatility after the announcement of the tariffs. Roughly what happened in the data is that US interest rates went up, US stock prices went down, and exchange rate volatility went up. Indeed, when we do this in our model, we get pretty similar numerical results in the sense that interest rates go up, stock prices go down, and volatility went up. In other words, in a very qualitative sense, and I guess quantitative sense, are this simple framework of currency risk does a pretty good job in capturing the effects of the trade war on the U.S. economy. Okay. Okay.
Tony, can I ask a question on comparing what you just described it with your recent paper on exchange rate stabilization. So,
Yeah.
I mean, in that paper, you are more like looking from the, I guess, small country perspective. What's the benefit of stabilizing exchange rate, and then you can enjoy lower interest rate, something like that. Can I view this tariff as kind of opposite of what small country has been doing, or is a different concept?
No, it's the same thing.
Yeah. Okay.
It's basically the opposite of
Exactly.
what is. So the target is different. So in some sense, in the other paper, which I'm going to talk about now,
Right.
which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, is basically that small countries impose a tax to manipulate their
Right.
exchange rate to stabilize. In this paper, there's a large country, the US. It's imposing a tax for an entirely different purpose. But the link between the two is that what ultimately describes what happens to asset prices in equilibrium in the world is just this mechanism of risk sharing. and safety.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Yeah.
it.
So
That's it.
so
Yeah.
that's the wedge on the risk sharing condition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Awesome.
What's
Yeah.
the, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Great
Awesome.
question.
Great. Yeah.
Okay, so there's going to be long-term consequences of the trade war as well, which is, of course, because the U.S. now has higher cost of capital and higher, it's less safe to invest in the U.S. Their capital accumulation goes down, wages goes down, and there's a lower correlation between the dollar is less of a safe haven currency. In fact, one of the things that you notice is, well, this is there's only there's many countries in the world, sorry, but if one currency is becoming less safe, other currencies are going to become more safe. And so what we're showing here is that we're showing the correlation between each country's real exchange rate, so there are broad currency indexes with the stochastic discount factor. And you can see that as tariffs increase, the correlation between the US dollar and the SDF goes down, but the next largest currency in the model, which is the euro, is going to go up. And at some point, basically, the euro is going to end up becoming the safest currency in the world. Okay, so we're saying a couple of things, a couple of different ways. In order to just move us along, I'm gonna click forward a little. But one of the nice things that we can show in the paper is that we can't show this theoretically, but empirically, what we can show is that we start off by looking at a full retaliation framework where the U.S. imposes a tariff and the rest of the countries fully retaliate. So if we impose 17% of the tariffs, the rest of the world imposes 17% tariffs on us. In reality, kind of shockingly, the rest of the world did not impose very many tariffs on the U.S. And so what happens if the U.S. imposes some large tariff, like 17% on imports, but the rest of the world only imposes a smaller tariff, say 7% on U.S. exports? Well, we can handle this case as well. A partial retaliation is basically analogous to a weaker full retaliation. And so the thing that you need to care about is the average tariff on imports and exports. That's going to determine how much the U.S. has now isolated itself from the rest of the world in this case. And how much the U.S. isolates itself from the rest of the world determines its effect on the risk sharing. Okay, so that was the second main finding. A trade war dampens the effect of U.S. shocks on the rest of the world. And so that's going to undermine foreigners' willingness to invest in the U.S. financial assets, and the U.S. is going to lose all these financial privileges that we first talked about. In the last 15 minutes, I'll talk about Steve's question, which is Steve raised a question about stabilizations. And so that's where we went with this paper. In some earlier work that I did with Tarek and Thomas, we looked at a world and we showed how this simple model can explain the current stabilization regime that we see in the world. In the sense that the vast majority of countries stabilize the U.S. And as they stabilize the U.S., they gain some financial privileges from doing that. And so, just to summarize what will happen, basically, if you're a small country like Singapore, or I don't know, Singapore is a good one, but let's say you're a smaller country, your currency is your impact on the world price of traded good is not high. Your currency is not that great. If you stabilize yourself relative to a large country like the US, your currency naturally inherits the safety properties of the US dollars. As long as that stabilization is credible. And so that's going to increase the covariance between your small country currency with the global price of traded goods. Foreign investors are going to see that. They're going to say, hey, investing in the Singapore dollar is really nice because it also gives me safety properties. And so I will do so. That's going to lower Singapore's domestic interest rates. Singaporean firms are going to become more valuable and attract global investment. And so the current monetary setup in the world is going to arise endogenously from this model where small countries stabilize to the US dollar. Okay. That was a nice part about that paper. How do we actually achieve that? as Steve kind of alluded to, we're basically we kind of did something similar in the paper where we say that these smaller countries are taxing consumption of traded goods. There are actually many ways of doing it. In in this paper, in this paper, we talk about you can also do it by imposing sticky prices and having a central bank that controls some money supply. Um, and but generally, the most basic way in the setup is that the central bank can levy a state contingent tax on traded goods, with this goal in mind. The variance of the small country's currency with some target country like the US is going to just be decreased. We're going to just shrink that. Okay. Um, how does it work? Well, you have to think, okay, if I'm a small country now, what am I typically doing? Um, if I'm a small country and like Singapore, and I see the US dollar appreciate, I have to manufacture an appreciation of my own in my own currency. How do I do that? I have to raise the marginal utility of households in my country. Okay. And I can do that by basically taxing consumption really heavily so that my own households they sell off all of their traded goods. And that's what's happening. That's what's going to happen in this framework. Whenever the US appreciates, Singapore is going to impose a really high tax. This is not really meaningful, but what's happening is Singapore is going to impose a really high tax on its state contingent tax on its households. Its own households are going to ship traded goods out, and the Singapore dollar is going to appreciate. This actually ends up being quite nice for the small country. They're selling traded goods whenever traded goods are expensive, and so in the end, it could there's going to be some trade-off, but it could be potentially welfare and enhancing for small countries to do this, um, uh, because even though they're getting a little bit higher consumption volatility, their bonds are going to be more valuable, their firms are going to be more valuable, and so they could benefit from some wealth effect. And so what you see here is that within this framework, small countries are going to be willing to actually stabilize their currencies because they can benefit from having um, more valuable firms. Whereas if you're a larger country and you're selling traded goods, you're going to have some larger price impact on the world market, and so it might not be as good for you. And so when you go through this exercise, and so when we did our exercise here in the paper, and we calibrated our model to the actual country sizes in the world, and we try to say, okay, which countries are willing to stabilize and which countries are not. What we end up finding is basically that we can match the data quite well in the sense that smaller countries in both the model and in the data, they tend to impose more strict stabilization, and they do so optimally. As you get larger and larger, you're going to impose fewer stabilizations, or you're going to impose weaker stabilizations. And for the largest countries in the world, you're not going to want to stabilize at all. Okay. Since this is the second kind of big fact that we're targeting, I want to just clarify again, why is this happening? It's happening because if you're a small country, okay, if you're a small country, you're going to benefit from having more valuable financial assets. You're getting basically a wealth transfer as your firms are becoming more valuable, and the rest of the world is willing to invest in your domestic economy. Okay. For larger countries, you do also get this wealth effect from the fact that your firms are more valuable, your bonds are more valuable, and other international investors are investing in you. But it also costs money. It also is expensive to engage in these stabilization policies because you're deviating from like the standard social planners problem. And the larger you are, the more price impact you have on the world as you deviate. And so that cost of stabilization ends up becoming more expensive than the gains from having better, more valuable financial assets. Okay. That's the intuition you should get. Okay, and so there we go. So small firms, they're going to want to, small countries, they are stabilizing, larger countries, less so. And so having this risk sharing mechanism in mind, um, you can basically replicate the current structure of the global financial system, and in particular, why all countries do you want to choose to stabilize to the largest country in the world. What happens if you impose a trade war? Okay. Well, you're doing exactly it's exactly what you think is going to happen, I think, at this point. Um, what does a trade war do? It erodes dollar safety. It erodes dollar safety by reducing covariance between the stochastic discount factor, this world price of traded good, and the value of the dollar. Okay? Well, if the dollar is less covaries less with, the stochastic discount factor, if I'm a small country like Singapore and I stabilize relative to the dollar, well, my currency is not going to look as safe either. So I don't gain any of the safety properties. I don't gain as much of the safety properties of the US dollar that I used to. Okay. And so it becomes no longer optimal for me to stabilize to the US dollar. And so the higher the tariff that the US imposes, the less optimal it becomes for smaller currencies to stabilize to the US dollar. Um, for a small country, we can actually, just kind of plot this out to say, all right, what is my small, I'm going to take a small country here. I'm going to compute its welfare, which is, expected utility from consumption, when it stabilizes relative to the dollar, when it floats, and when it stabilizes to something else like the euro. And so the first thing you're going to notice on the left-hand side is that, exactly as I talked about already, stabilizing to the dollar is better than floating because I've made my financial assets more valuable. However, as the US tariffs increase, dollar loses its safety properties, stabilizing to the dollar becomes less and less valuable, until at some point it becomes more valuable to stabilize to someone else. In the context of our model, it's going to be the euro.
Tony,
You can do this. Yeah.
Tony, on this picture, are you assuming the euro is not retaliating?
No, this is a picture in which the euro retaliates. The euro retaliates. What was it? 40%, just like in the real world.
I see. So,
But
but then,
yeah,
yeah. So, but then the difference will be the US is kind of tariff everywhere, but euro is only retaliating towards the US, I guess.
yeah.
I
So
see.
the euro still has everyone else to trade with, just not the US.
I
I,
see. I
I I
see.
have that similar questions as well. Like if the US is targeting specific countries, let's say
Country C.
China, yeah, country C, for example, and then for country D, they're subsidizing. Uh, what would be the impact for a tariff in general? Like, uh, would it change the geopolitics like situation without changing the safety effect of the dollar?
That's a good question. Yeah. In short, this is like a plug for this next paper that we're working on, which is where we're trying to use this same kind of framework to think through different currency regions of stabilization and tariffs. Sorry, different regions for tariff barriers, I guess. And the short answer is essentially that the dominant force here still has to be still ends up becoming who co-varies more with the world's price of traded goods. And so if you're blocking out China completely, you basically have to see how large is the rest of the countries in the world. If China, as China is growing. If China becomes the greatest country, the largest country, largest economy in the world, and you're trying to tariff that, that might be worse for the U.S. But if the U.S. maintains its size and economic advantage, the economic size, then, in the end, maybe it may not be that bad if it can convince everyone to tariff China together. So,
Cool.
yeah. Short answer is you can stay tuned and we'll have that out in a couple of months. Um,
Great.
but essentially we try to do this a little bit more systematically for all the countries in the world and depending on the size of their share of world GDP. And we have this figure that seem I don't know what this figure is called, but these figures are very popular these days. But the point is that, if you're starting here with zero tariffs, um, what is the prediction of what the international monetary system looks like? Larger countries with high shares of the world GDP, they freely float. As you get to medium-sized countries, they're going to have a soft stabilization to the US, and the smaller countries, they're going to hard peg to the US. But as tariffs increase, that that benefit from stabilizing to the US is going to decline. And if tariffs increase enough, in our framework, it's at 26%. So if the US imposes a effective tariff of about 26% for an extended period of time, basically that's where our model starts predicting that everyone just shifts over to the next country, which in our case is the euro. Okay. Is the US actually what's up?
Sorry, so here you make tau as a parameter. So what if tau is a stochastic process so that there's uncertainty around it? Would that change anything in the model?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the problem with tariffs right now is the uncertainty of the whole thing. Um, it depends on the nature of the uncertainty, but if it's like in the realistic case, if it's like the US where there is tariff and then there's not tariff, um, uh, then it basically becomes a weaker tariff because you don't it's like the tariff is there, but then it goes away and so it's potentially just a weaker version of a committed tariff.
Right.
Okay. Um, yeah, good question. Um, that's basically all I wanted to cover today. We have this model. And I think if I could leave you with anything is that, this very simple model of the world, uh, can get you pretty far into describing, basically the current state of affairs. The U.S. with both the what the world looked like prior to the tariff announcements, that U.S. shocks have large impacts on the rest of the world. And as a result, you have this safety premium for the dollar and the financial privileges of the dollar, as well as, because you have the financial privileges of the dollar, and the safety properties of the dollar, you can endogenously get out like what does the global financial system look like in the current setup of um, exchange rate stabilizations. And at the same time, you can get pretty far into thinking about what's going to happen in a trade war and how does a breakdown of the risk sharing mechanisms in the world affect the safety properties of the dollar and what that does to different countries' willingness to maintain the dollar peg. Yeah, that's basically it. Forward to Antonio's discussion, I guess.
Thank you very much, Tony. Antonio, feel free to share your slides. Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Well, so thanks so much, Dongshan, the organizers, for inviting me to discuss this paper. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a fascinating paper. So just to recap, the question that Tony and his co-authors are asking is essentially how does the rising wave of economic nationalism, the new wave of trade protectionism, if you think about it in the context of global hegemon, right, the US economy, how does that affect the US dollar status as a global safe haven currency, as a global reserve currency, and particularly as an anchor currency for other countries, and particularly small open economies in their choice of exchange rate regime. And so what they're doing in the paper is building a general equilibrium model that links trade flows and trade integration essentially to currency risk premia and safe haven properties of the country. And it's also a model where, on the small open economy side, you have these endogenous exchange rate regime, right? So effectively these endogenous pegging choices, so that then you can think about the anchor role of the currency. And so really the point that the paper is making in this context is that the safety properties of the dollar and ultimately, the willingness of other countries to peg to the dollar, either soft pegs or hard pegs, all of that is endogenous to the integration, to the trade integration in terms of goods markets of the US in the world economy. And fundamentally, the mechanism here is what Tony was walking you through, right? Which is that in the model, the US is this large trade integrated economy, and so domestic demand shocks tend to spill over into international markets, particularly in terms of the price of traded goods, which through the mechanism that Tony described leads to this particular covariance, right? It causes the dollar to appreciate exactly in the states of the world where a global marginal utility of consumption is high, right? So you have this positive covariance with the global stochastic discount factor, and that's what defines the dollar status as a safe haven. Now, if you go and introduce sharp tariffs, or like a trade war protectionism, that sort of breaks this mechanism. It breaks this link, right? So the trade wars are gonna isolate the US in global goods markets. So what that means is US shocks are going to spill over less. It's going to dampen this mechanism. And so that's going to lead to a loss of dollar safety, which then shows up in the pegging choices of other countries. And so the key, and I would say pretty provocative result here, is that if you have a severe trade war, which they also calibrate, right? So they get to this sort of 26% tipping point, you can trigger this big phase shift in the international monetary system where you lose the anchor status. Now smaller economies want to switch pegs to your competitor, which is the euro and the calibration. And that leads also to a loss of the exorbitant privilege of the US, right? So US interest rates and borrowing costs are going to rise. So I think it's a very timely paper. As I said, it's provocative, very interesting. It gives a very nice framework for thinking about these questions of deglobalization, which are just more and more relevant given everything that's happening in the world. Okay, so let me give a few comments. I'll give some high-level comments here. So the first one is that I think, there is a part of this mechanism, and it's both about the transmission mechanism and the mechanism that supports your reserve currency status, which is not necessarily about trade, but I think there's really important financial channels here as well, right? So the paper is really mostly focusing on these trade-based channels, but we know that the US is not just a trade hegemon, right? It's also at the center of global finance, right? And that's true in several ways, right? So we know that there's an outsized fraction of global financial contracts that get denominated in the US dollar, the same way that, in trade invoicing, disproportionate share of global trade, even when the US is not involved, gets denominated in dollars. So there's a parallel there on the finance side. And then we know that, US monetary policy has big spillovers internationally, right? So it drives global leverage, it drives global risk pricing in a way that, of course, I don't want to claim we understand it fantastically in the literature, but might be quite independent of trade flows. Okay, and so I think once you start thinking about these financial channels, it really matters for the paper's argument in two different respects. So one is actually the spillover mechanism, right? Which is now, these financial channels give you another way for US domestic shocks to influence world markets and potentially lead to the safe haven properties of the currency, right? So And there's this question, which is, if you block trade, if you have this wave of protectionism, but you still have lots of capital market integration, is it still possible that US shocks are going to drive global risk? Right? So it's still possible that you might maintain that safe haven property of the currency independent of the trade integration and trade spillover mechanisms. And then there's a second side where I think that the financial channel is very important, which is there's another reason, potentially, why you might support the status of the currency as an anchor and as a global reserve currency, which has to do with liquidity network effects. And lots of people have thought about this. I've done some research on this as well, right? Which is once you have, that sort of strategic complementarity in global financial contract denomination, even potentially if you lose some of the safe haven property of the currency, that might still be another reason why, as a country, you want to manage your exchange rate to the dollar, why, private agents might want to keep doing financial business in the dollar. And so I think these are all very important questions that are really ripe for further research in this area. And I think it's sort of a complementary part of the story that's potentially just as important as the trade side. Second comment is about sort of this dynamics of transitioning from one anchor to another, and really the potential inertia in the anchor currency equilibrium. Right? So the model is predicting this very sharp tipping point to the euro, which the calibration is around. This happens when tariffs are on an average level around 26% in the US. This is a very ambitious prediction. I actually like it. I think it's totally fine in this paper because, as Tony was saying, this is a Brookings paper. It's not meant to. It's not like the standard paper. So I think it's actually totally okay in this context, and I'm not complaining about it. But of course, it is a difficult prediction, right? And maybe we want to take it with a grain of salt in the sense that there's tons of scope here for other channels, like the financial channels that I told you about, for model misspecification. Perhaps you want to do this in a dynamic model to think carefully about the transition dynamics, which is not to criticize this paper, but these are all things that can be developed maybe in future research. And in particular, if you think about history, I think that, so I was thinking, the paper made me think about the historical evidence a bit. And I do think that historically, we don't have that many data points, but it does look like these anchor and reserve currency transitions are actually fairly slow and inertial. They don't really happen with these sudden shifts, absent a sudden fiscal collapse. Okay, so there are certainly cases in history where you have this, immediate shift from one dominant currency to another, and this happened very prominently, in the transition between the Dutch florin, which was really the first global reserve and anchor currency of the modern era, to the British pound. And this happened after the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, where essentially, the Bank of Amsterdam just completely collapsed because it essentially defaulted on a bunch of its liabilities. And, it was really this big fiscal shock, what we today would call a fiscal shock, I think triggered this sudden collapse and transition. But if you think about the other big transition of the modern era, which was from the British pound to the dollar, that actually was fairly slow, and that did involve a bit the same size channel that Tony and co-authors are thinking about, right? Like, if you actually look at the time series, the US overtook the whole of the British Empire in size, both in terms of GDP and also in terms of trade volumes, actually at the turn of the century. This was around 1900, 1901. But, the British pound remained quite dominant in central bank reserves, in global finance and contract denomination for almost 50 years after, right? So up until almost the end of the Second World War. And I think that sort of speaks to how important some of these network effects in trade invoicing and global liquidity provision are, which can generate this inertia. There's also another question I think we have to ask, which is the euro really ready to be the anchor? I think another sort of lesson from history is that historically, reserve currency issuers tend to be countries that provide, on a massive scale, at least relative to everyone else, safe and very liquid assets, right? So of course the US dollar does this with US treasuries. We don't know exactly how important that part is quantitatively, but it is true that the euro area today, it still suffers from fragmentation risk, from the fact that there's no single unified sort of fiscal safe asset that rivals the treasury market in depth in liquidity. And so, I do have this question, which is, even if we were to go to this very high level of tariffs, are we really going to jump into this alternative world where the euro is the anchor? I suspect that the tipping point might be more of this sort of long and messy slope than this sort of sharp cliff. And then third comment is about how we define safety, sort of in the modern era, in a more geopolitically fragmented world. Right? So in the model, safety is really defined in the standard asset pricing sense. It's hedging consumption risk. I think today there's, trade wars are correlated with geopolitical conflict, and there's other types of risk that you might worry about, in terms of exchange rate choice, in terms of currency adoption, including geopolitical risk, right? Like, for example, safety for Russia, for China, or even for, European allies might mean we want protection from sanctions, from expropriation. We don't want to be frozen out of the payment system, etc. Right? And so I think there's a fascinating extension here, which is, if you started thinking about these other types of risk, sanctions risk, geopolitical risk in the context of a model like that, how would that interact with the trade channel? How would that change your predictions? So just to conclude, I think this is a very compelling paper. Sort of it gives us this clear, tractable narrative on sort of the fragility of the exorbitant privilege and the international status of the US dollar. And I think, it's giving us this point that I'm broadly, that I'm really on board with, which is US dominance in the financial side, in the international monetary system, might be contingent on economic integration. And the details of that, is that just about trade? Is it about capital account integration, etc.? That's, I think there's a lot of research to be done there, but it's certainly a very salient warning on the potential costs of protectionism. I think there's tons of interesting directions to do both qualitatively and quantitatively in this area, in this agenda. So as I said, I really enjoy reading it. I look forward to seeing how you guys continue working on this agenda.
Great. Thanks so much, Antonio, for your great discussion. Tony, feel free to respond for 1 or 2 minutes.
No, thanks a lot, Antonio. Really cool stuff. And I don't know if anyone has anything to say. Feel free to interrupt. But again, I think it's absolutely right. I think if one thing I could leave everyone with here is that this simple model, you can go really far. And so to most of Antonio's points, we've all thought about it in the context of our own framework. For example, with the capital account, one of the things we talked about is if we don't stabilize to the US, do you stabilize to Europe? And a natural question here is always like, well, why not stabilize to China? China has a pretty close capital account. I mean, it's pretty hard to invest in Chinese assets here, and so there's clearly like a link between who enters into the international monetary system and how freely floating is their capital. These are all things that you can also address within our framework because we have extensions where we look at what assets people actually do hold that would decentralize a social planner's problem. These are all fairly simple, straightforward extensions in our framework. Other things like dynamics, very, very. I mean, you can see it's a very simple model. It's very straightforward to do. These are all. We're hoping that people take our framework and do these cool extensions with it because these are problems that can be solved, can be looked at within this broader framework. And so I just want to say thank you to Antonio. Great points. And I'm happy to stay on for a little bit, but otherwise, thanks so much.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you guys for joining this seminar. We have great paper from Tony and a great discussion from Antonio today. On January 30th, we are going to have Xiang who give us another seminar. So Thank you very much, guys, for joining the seminar. I hope you guys have a great day. See you soon.